The relationship isn't the problem, it just reveals the problem within you.
Today on the Men's Therapy Podcast, we're joined by the incredible Donald Bialkowski. As a clinical social worker specializing in mindful relating and relational leadership, Donald brings a fresh perspective to one of the most important and challenging aspects of our lives: relationships.
Being in a relationship is a skill. It's like a slow erosion of the relationship. I do believe there's such a thing as emotional affairs, and they're very damaging. Betrayal is up there on the list of one of the most difficult human experiences, and it can also often be, for the hurt partner, it's often very traumatic.
In this episode, we're exploring everything from the universal struggles with communication to the emotional demands of modern partnerships. Donald sheds light on why younger couples are stepping up to learn essential relational skills and how unresolved childhood dynamics often find their way into our adult relationships.
For me, what's most painful about the affair is the deceit. Whether it's emotional, whether it's physical, whether it's financial. A man that doesn't have any anger to their partner is kind of a dangerous man. And a man who's super angry is also kind of a dangerous man. It's hard to slow down, stop, and be honest with yourself. Your emotion is Latin for in motion. All of your emotions, they're like indicators for what you need. So if you're feeling lonely, then you need to connect. If you're feeling anxious, you need to prepare. If you're feeling angry, boundaries been crossed.
Have you ever wondered what masculinity even is in the modern era? Are you ready to move beyond the macho bully or the soy boy archetypes? I'm Marc Azoulay, and this is the Men's Therapy Podcast. Together, we'll explore how neuroscience, Jungian psychology, and Buddhist philosophy can transform your life, your marriage, and your business. Are you ready to deep dive into the minds of men? Let's begin.
Hello, welcome back to the Men's Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Marc Azoulay, and I'm here with returning guest, Donald Bialkowski. So he's a clinical social worker. He works a lot with men. He works a lot with couples. He works a lot, there's my cat in there. He works a lot with people struggling, going through divorces. And what his real specialty is mindful relating and mindful leadership, and relational leadership, which I think is really critical and something that is needed so much in the world today. Happy to have him back on the show. If you want to learn more about him, you can go back and check out his previous episode. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. But we're just going to dive right in. So, Donald, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks, Mark. It's great to be back. Good to see you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to keep the conversation going because we had such a great episode last time talking about kind of, your matrix for health, right, and for mindful leadership and how to really change the paradigm on what it means to be a leader and moving into a more connected space, which I think is critical for especially the younger generations, millennials and Gen Zs. So today I want to focus more on relationships. So you mentioned that you do a lot of couples work. Let's actually start you there. What are some typical trends or typical issues that your couples are coming to you with? What are you kind of just, boots on the ground? What are you seeing out there today as what people are really struggling with?
Yeah, I think it's just, communication is probably number one always. That's usually what I hear when I ask couples how I can help them is to communicate better. They don't feel like we're on the same page. I'll say I probably get I'll get younger couples that are just getting together and they already know something's off, something's not working, and they're more willing and ready to kind of resource themselves. And so they're more they come to me and present to me as kind of just learners. They want to learn what is it to be in a relationship, which is great because being in a relationship is a skill. There's lots of skills. And then I get other couples that have kind of been at it for a while, maybe 10, 15 years, maybe careers and kids and all of that. And how they've been getting along has not been working, and now they're at sort of a crisis point, or perhaps already over a crisis point. There's been some affair or some betrayal of some sort, and now we're doing kind of more emergency, we got to fix this thing now kind of thing. So,
yeah. So let's start with that first group, right? The younger couple that they think something's off. Maybe they're doing some premarital counseling, right? They just kind of want to learn because I know, my generation, millennial generation, right? We were children of divorce. So a lot of us didn't have models. Physically, literally didn't have models of what a healthy relationship was, so what are some of the things that you educate them on? What are some of the skills that you feel our generation wasn't taught?
Gosh. Yeah. I mean, I think that it is interesting because I think these younger couples, like there's enough out there, there's enough content, there's enough resources where they sort of like know these things, but it's one thing to know these things and another thing to do these things. So really what I like to teach, and this is couples across all generations, but it begins with kind of just a frame and really understanding that the relationship is kind of like the container for learning, like that. If you can sort of like, if I can get a couple to reorient from like toe to toe at one another and that sort of like conflict or avoidance kind of position to like shoulder to shoulder and really be a we and really be a team, then they can really use their relationship as an opportunity to kind of continue to grow. I would say one, actually my wife and our couple therapist many years ago said to us, the relationship isn't the problem. It just reveals the problem within you. So that's sort of like, if I can make that shift, and that's usually where I start with couples, is just recognizing that your partner sort of is bringing up within you parts of you that aren't working in the relationship. Like that's so more of an orientation kind of versus like a skill. But that's often where I'll start with a couple and kind of creating that orientation. So I'll stop there. Did I answer your question?
It does. Yeah. I think it's like, I guess what I think of is, I think for young couples, the emotional demands and emotional requirements are way higher. I think because people tend to be a lot more educated, like you said, right? I mean, there's so many books out there about couples. There's so much stuff right now on Instagram and TikTok just around what to even expect. There's all kinds of diagnostic material, good and bad, of like, hey, here's a toxic relationship. Here's a healthy relationship. Here's red flags. I think it's being talked about in a way that I don't think it's ever really been talked about this much before. And I'm hearing what you're saying, right? Like, it's one thing to learn, I think, to actually put into practice. So you say that people's parts get activated. Can you provide an example of those parts, or maybe a case study of somebody who is kind of dropping into those younger parts and what that might look like in a relationship? Because I don't think people always know when that's happening. They kind of get blindsided.
Yeah. No, that's true. And that's part of why I think couples is helpful, because you have another person outside of the system that can kind of elevate that. Because when you're in it, you're kind of too close to yourself to see that often until, you start giving this attention and start raising your awareness around it. Yeah, I can certainly share. I just met with a couple, so I'll use them. But I'll say this, and this is in part two, an answer to your earlier question around skill. So I think the skill of all skills is really relational mindfulness. And as it relates to parts, so this is one way to think about it. And there's different models that talk about parts. But I think that's a helpful way to think about ourselves. We're not just like one mono mind, but we have parts of us that, want to go out for dinner tonight, and parts of us that want to stay home, and parts, so we're kind of complex. We have lots of these parts that sort of that make us who we are. And sort of maybe a simplified version of that, and I use this a lot, is sort of one part is your wise adult, and that's your mature, sort of reasonable, collaborative. This part tends to be kind of loose and graceful and sort of willing, really fluid. And that's your most mature, best version of yourself. And then there's an adaptive part, which I call the adaptive child. This comes from Terry Real's work, Relational Life Therapy. And that part of you is an earlier version, usually develops around 7, 8, 9 years of age. And it's a protective part. And that part is not interested in collaborating. It's not really interested in getting along, right? Like, it's really interested in being protected. So that part, from a mindfulness standpoint, usually you might notice that part because they're really rigid, really black and white thinking, constricted in the body, unwilling, not graceful, not willing to forgive, not willing to sort of collaborate. So for me, when that part of you shows up in the relationship, nothing is really getting done. That part doesn't want to get along. So the first sort of skill of all skills is being aware of like which part of you is in the room. If it's your adaptive child, then nothing's happening. You're likely going to make the situation worse. You're going to get caught in a cycle, a relational cycle that's problematic. But if your wise adult is in the room, then we can get on to what are some other skills around like, cherishing or sort of appreciation, I statements, speaking from your experience, asking for what you need, like all those sort of like traditional relational skills.
Yeah. So I think that the adaptive child part, I think some people like live in that, and I know for me, kind of like the relationship being the mirror. So when I was dating Caroline, and it still comes up, I'm not like over this, right? But like I have this story of if I don't do it, no one's going to do it, right? And that story leads to a lot of loneliness. It leads to a lot of resentment. It leads to a lot of anger. And again, I still do this, but like I find myself recreating that over and over again, and believing that that's true. Right. And one way I'm doing that is like actually not asking for help. Right. Or when she suggests something, pushing it away immediately. Right. Or like saying, oh, it's not good enough. You're not doing it in the right way or whatever. Right. And like it just reiterating this story over and over again, which, it's protecting me. The good side is like it's motivated me to start a business and kind of, be self-motivated and individualistic. Right. But in a relationship, it sucks. In a relationship that is like a complete disconnector. And it's difficult for me to know when that's true and when that's not true. Because in the moment when I feel that way, when I feel like I'm the sole person that's responsible for everything, it feels so true. I'm really good at convincing myself that is the truth, So how does someone work with something like that? I mean, how do you use mindfulness to start to deconstruct that?
Happy to answer that. And I want to say that, in the spirit of mindfulness, it's not like that part of you isn't good or bad. It's just a misapplication. It's sort of like no longer, that was an adaptation. It was adaptive then in an earlier time, and now it's maladaptive. Now it's getting in the way. So my adaptive child, which by the way, you never really get rid of them, but with mindfulness and awareness, you are aware of it more. You can sort of get back to your wise adult faster. You spend less time there. But I can see my adaptive child like 3 times at dinner with my kids, but because I'm aware of it, I don't get pulled into it. I don't react that way. But just to use me as an example, as you just did, like my adaptive child withdraws. So I tend to withdraw, which is great to protect myself. And it certainly came in sort of handy when I was a kid, but in my marriage, not so much. My wife doesn't like a withdrawn partner. It doesn't create a flourishing situation. So part of, getting my relationship sort of calibrated to grow and is just not allowing my adaptive part to kind of take over in the relationship. But So I think I was going to share. So I just met with a couple early, right before we met, and they're a young couple, kind of getting going. They've got some young ones. I think one a toddler and a 3-year-old, and she has a kind of a traumatic history, a really tumultuous upbringing, and he has grew up in a family that really didn't talk a lot about emotions. So he doesn't have a lot of emotions, and she has a lot. There's a lot of sort of instability. Her nervous system is really kind of amped up given her history. And so when they come together, if she's really amped up, that's overwhelming. So then he withdraws. And so their sort of dance is, when she's having emotions, he withdraws. So this is sort of a classic pursuer withdrawer kind of dynamic. But for me, as a couples counselor, is like I can help see that for them. They can't see that. It feels familiar, and they do that. So a lot of my initial work, again, on this relational mindfulness is just bringing their attention to see, when I'm really like upset, then you withdraw, right? And just, how can we, and often that is a big kind of aha moment for couples. And then we can start working with, well, how do we just not do that? Because when we do that, things kind of fall apart and things turn into a bigger mess.
Yeah. So it sounds like just having like language awareness is huge, and being like, we need to do anything but this default shitty pattern that we fall into, and I like the way you're talking about it, because like you said, there's no judgment there. It's like, okay, this is just what these variables are going to do. This is the chain reaction that happens, and we can both try to interrupt the chain reaction whenever possible. We cover into the next topic of like, the number one question that's asked from listeners of this podcast is, what is a toxic relationship? How do I know if my relationship is toxic, and how do I get out of it? So I'm curious how you would answer that, right? How, using kind of this model, how do you know if a relationship is toxic? If it's something that you really just need to leave, if it's not workable,
Gosh, that can come, there's sort of different flavors of ice cream there. Some couples are like fighters, and so they might be very, very aware that their relationship isn't working because they're throwing plates and putting holes in the wall and that kind of thing. And then there's also withdrawers. And so those couples are a little trickier because there's not something that's really like operatic or volcanic to be like, oh, this isn't sort of working. But they're lonely, typically, or they're disconnected, or they're just feeling flat, or they're feeling unfulfilled. So, people have a sense within them whether they're feeling like their relationship is really like helping, adding to their life, that it's vital, that it's helping them grow, or that something is kind of off. And then if something's off, there's kind of like different varieties of that or different extremes of that.
Yeah. So I know a lot of people talked about the explosive relationship, but I want to ask you about the dull, flat one, because I don't think people talk about that as much. Like, what's that like? Wax poetic on that a little bit. What is that like from the inside, and how can people start to shake that up? Or is it something where it's like, okay, I guess we're just not a fit. We got to move on.
Well, I think people kind of default to that, and that's a larger sort of cultural issue that you were talking about. We don't have the societal structures of like smaller communities and like, so, there's like those people. So it is really easy for us to just be like, well, I don't like this. And I want, and we look at social media and there's all these other people doing all this other stuff. So, but those are often really workable relationships, especially if couples are willing to kind of like resource themselves. I would say that I probably see the more of the withdrawal type couple, the non-fighting couples later on when they have some children. There's been some kind of crisis because it's more like it's like a slow erosion of the relationship. It doesn't really, it might look like, yeah, we're great co-parents. We get along great. All of our friends from the outside would say we're just like the perfect couple, but they're not really connected, right? This is sort of like living together. But then that can sort of, lead into, the most common is it like a betrayal. It could be a financial betrayal, obviously a romantic or a relational betrayal is a big piece. And that sort of wakes people up to this realization that they've been slowly drifting apart for 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah. So there's a lot of that, right? Like, I see so much of that because I work with a lot of divorced dudes, and like, that's what they talk about, where it's been dead for a while. They often say, yeah, we're good business partners, but we're not in a relationship anymore, right? We're doing it all for the kids. It's really, really common. And then, either they cheat or their wife cheats or something, whether it's a physical or emotional affair. So yeah, how do you start to right the ship on that, man? Like how do you start to like bring that spark back or at least, I don't know, start to talk about it? Like, what would you do with a couple that comes in presenting that issue?
Well, it depends. I would say probably, 2/3 of my couples are probably dealing with some kind of crisis. And so like from a couple's standpoint, it's really about the repair. It's depending, it's usually a bit of crisis stabilization, betrayal is up there on the list of one of the most difficult human experiences. And it can also often be for the hurt partner, it's often very traumatic because, it sort of undercuts how they see the world, like everything feels like it's a lie. So a lot of times a hurt partner will experience really what looks like trauma, re-experiencing intrusive thoughts, like loss of weight, inability to sleep, insomnia, things like that. So if couples are coming to me with that kind of relational crisis, it's really about stabilization. And then it's like a repair, having the involved partner take some ownership, take some responsibility that, they're not a bad person, but they made some bad choices, or at least their choices were really hurtful. And then after that, oftentimes it's about what happened. And that's when you get after more of those relational dynamics. Oftentimes people have affairs, not because they're terrible people, but because of like something was missing, right? It's usually an artifact of a maladaption of that earlier part. Maybe that earlier part, which is really walled off, is feeling really lonely and really disconnected in the relationship. So they go somewhere else to sort of fill that void. The problem is it's pretty empty, right? Like it's not actually filling that void.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, right? Like, do you believe in emotional affairs? Do you believe that an emotional affair is a real thing, or how does that manifest? Yeah.
100%. And for me, what's most painful about the affair is the deceit. So whether it's emotional, whether it's physical, whether it's financial, I mean, all of those sort of live very similarly. It's like, whoa, like, wait a second. I thought we saw the world in a similar way. And it turns out that, we haven't. And that's a huge gap then to close that. Like you've been doing what for how long? You've been having an affair for 10 years, even an emotional one, right? So I do believe there's such a thing as emotional affairs, and they're very damaging.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that the deceit is what's critical, right? Because I think emotional affairs can get twisted sometimes, because at least I believe like it's okay to have friends of the opposite gender, and it's okay to like love them, right, in a way that a family would or a close friend would. But I'm hearing it's like the secret part that is really dangerous, because there's some level of like shame there, or some level of, I guess like pain. I read like, I guess guilt. They know that there's something wrong, or they know that their primary partner would not approve of them being with this other person. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah. I mean, if you are doing or saying anything that your partner wouldn't approve of, you might want to pay attention to that. That you're in that boundary, you're in that sort of risk zone, which is so easy now too with like social media. Like you can form relationships so quickly, and so you can, and everything's so fast, right? And there's speed, and you can sort of like be having these relationships because you just don't have time to update your partner on every single thing and that kind of thing. But I just wanted to say something about like around like working with polyamorous couples, having an open marriage, there's a contract there. That's the important piece. And so those partners are getting some physical experiences, emotional experience for sure, but it's not a betrayal until the contract is broken, right? So if one of those, if both partners are on the same page, it's workable. It's no problem, right? It can be balanced. It could be healthy if that's the relationship, sort of the nature of that relationship. But as soon as one of those partners starts withholding particular information around that relationship, that's when it sort of crosses over into a betrayal or deceit, and then that's when the relationship is subject to some significant hurt and crisis.
Yeah. Do you work with polyamorous couples? Like, is that a part of your practice?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, more and more for sure. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Tell me about that, because I just see a huge upswing of that. I mean, I'm in Colorado and Denver, which is like probably like the second queer state after, California, right? And there's so much of that now, even compared to 5 and certainly 10 years ago. Are you seeing the same thing? Are you seeing like an upswing of people trying out polyamorous lifestyles or opening up their marriages?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think just culturally, we're seeing it open up around gender, sexuality, like partnerships, institutions, gender roles, with that sort of more nuanced or fluid sort of understanding with that. Yeah, I think naturally people, are experimenting with different relationship configurations. And yeah, so it's kind of interesting. Yeah, it's nuanced in a lot of ways, but in some ways it kind of brings to attention some of these things that sort of a more sort of traditional relationship sort of takes for granted, right? Like there's a lot of these unspoken contracts, like, oh, there's this and this. And because it sort of like fits into a traditional mold, it doesn't really get talked about. So if you're sort of in a non-traditional relationship and you come to me, you're likely already having these kind of conversations. Like, what does it look like if I'm with this person or not, where like that's an unspoken sort of understanding and often a misunderstanding in a more sort of traditional configuration.
Yeah. So I guess if I hear you correctly, it's like you would say that traditional configurations can benefit from having contracts similar to a polyamorous thing, right? Instead of having everything being like hidden, right, or being taken for granted, actually really talking about these types of different issues. Yeah, I mean, what are some things that people should talk about? So say like a listener's listening right now and they're in a traditional configuration. What should they go and talk to their partner about after listening to this episode? What are some things that maybe don't get spoken as much as they should?
Yeah, well, I think I always think about it like our minds kind of have this ability. I think of this image of like when we get together and we're coming together, we sort of take like a Polaroid of our partner, and then we often relate to that Polaroid, And so, I love exercises like just like 20 different questions, like getting to know your partner. But because we're constantly evolving and changing, the important piece is that you're doing that. So it's more like the recurrence and staying connected versus like the specifics of what's going on. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it sounds like there's not a specific question, but it's just being more fluid and flexible with your partner and kind of like seeing them as they are, not as you want them to be, right? Or not as they were when you first started dating.
Yeah, it's staying like it's updating your software, it's like updating, like the programming is like, so it's really relationally, it's building that sort of like relational hygiene, it's like, oh, we're going to touch base and that's when these relational skills come in, like communication. How are you? What's important to you right now? Like, what are you most excited about? Like these kinds of things as a way to get to know your partner. Or you could do something more formal, like if you've gotten like married and you did vows, for example, what a lot of couples in that scenario will do is like, that's their contract and they never revisit it. So 15 years and I find out you're sleeping with your, like boss, well, that's a violation of the contract. But like, if a couple is sort of renewing their vows or even just revisiting and having that conversation, they're less likely to be in that scenario.
Yeah, I think relationships have to be so intentional. I mean, that's what's like sweeping over me as you're talking is like, they have to be so intentional. And yeah, I mean, I never saw my parents do any of this stuff. And I imagine most of our listeners didn't either, of like seeing like the strategy and the check-ins and the skill building. And I agree with you. I mean, for the record, like I think it's a ton of work to have an actually fulfilling relationship that is meeting kind of the modern demands of emotional needs. I think the default relationship is the like, we're surviving together. We're, co-paying for the groceries. We're, raising a kid, but there is such a higher level when it comes to being actually intimate and vulnerable and connective.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything more challenging, honestly, than a modern committed relationship is really continuous effort. Even if you have all the skills in place and you're good communicators and you're emotionally responsive and it still takes kind of constant work, which is hard because there's so much happening, especially if you look at like the life cycle of a marriage. You get together, it's great, you're connected, you're communicating, but then one kid comes along, maybe, or two kids, and then like the few dogs, and then, work and all this stuff. And it's just like, if you're not prioritizing that time, you're growing more distant just because of the sort of the currents of life.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it can really just like start to atrophy. Let me throw this at you because I see this with a lot of dudes, right? And I think a lot of relationships maybe in general, but like, so how do I put this thought together? I think a lot of men, right, me included, maybe you, like when we're young, we have this image of being like the James Bond, right? We have like tons of women. We're like traveling all over the world. Like the goal of a relationship is like to be cool, have a lot of sex, build status, fun, right? It's about like fun and experience building. But then, right, when we go into like the building phase, for most people, that's maybe building a family, but it could be just building a home, right? Or building, a project or whatever. Like it changes, and I think a lot of men that I've worked with, they struggle to change their model. Like they still think a relationship should be about fun and sex and status and all this. And then they're like holding their partner to this kind of adolescent model. Versus like, okay, actually the function of a relationship is to be building something together, building a life together, versus just gathering a lot of experiences. So then when I see the affairs, it's often guys going back to that kind of like younger mode of being like, oh, well, I just wanted like the fun girlfriend. I didn't actually want like a mom. I didn't actually want like a wife. I just wanted someone to have a lot of fun with. So I guess my question is, what do you think about that idea? And do you see that in the work that you do as well?
Yeah, I mean, I often say the patriarchy hasn't done many favors. It's this old way of like getting socialized into these more traditional versions. I just sat with a group of men and had this conversation, which is sort of constantly happening because it's complex. It's like, what is a modern man? Like, what are those pieces that, are true and have been true for tens of thousands of years in terms of masculinity, but also like, the cultural piece around us has changed so rapidly. There's such a disconnection between sort of, how men get socialized and how the world sort of operates, that sort of like that relational position of a more sort of power over, if I can generalize around like sort of like how boys get sort of socialized to prove their masculinity, to be strong, to stand, all those sort of messages don't really work very well in a modern relationship, because again, generally speaking, in a heterosexual couple, just to use that as an example, that the female partner is demanding more because they've been socialized in a way that's a little bit more like, I don't really, need you, or it's sort of like, or whatever the messages are. The point is, it's complex, but the point is you get this sort of like mismatch around how you should show up in a relationship. So that's one contributing factor is how we get socialized around gender roles.
If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please hit the subscribe button and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us to reach more men and inspire them to become the best versions of themselves. Thank you for your support. And now back to the show.
I have a guy that comes to therapy, right? And he gets in touch with his emotions. And now he's more emotional, he's more mindful, he's more aware. He brings it to his wife and she freaks out. She freaks out because she's never seen him cry or, be weak, right? Or even get angry. A lot of these guys have kept like a very stoic, like narrow band of what it means to be a man. Now they're opening it up. And I think because of socialization, I think it's tough for a lot of women to handle. It's similar where it's like they ask for it, but then when they get it, it's hard, right? I think it takes work to be able to like take in and switch those roles, even though I think it's ideal, right? To both be able to do that. But the initial reaction I've seen so many times is like shock and sometimes even disgust. Do you see that in the work that you do?
Yeah, I love that. I love this. I refer to this as the masculine double bind. And it's sort of like, there's two things that come up for me around this is one is like, women are socialized in the patriarchy as well, right? And so in these sort of more traditional sort of views of masculinity. And so I remember my wife at one point says like, I don't want a weak man. I'm trying to be this modern, sensitive guy, and she's like, I don't want a weak man, so like, whatever that is, I mean, I think there is something to that around like leadership. And for me, this is about like equanimity, and ability to be steady, have emotions, but not be like pulled away by your emotions. So like a man that doesn't have any anger to their partner is kind of a dangerous man. And a man who's super angry is also kind of a dangerous man. So what you're looking for in a sort of secure attachment, I don't love that language, but like to be like secure, like I am angry and steady and I got this and I got you and we got this together, right? And I'm having these emotions. So it's more like, I think when men start to learn, that emotional vocabulary and they begin to develop that, they haven't really developed the equanimity around that to sort of be like, yeah, I'm angry, and talk about their feelings in a way that doesn't feel shaky. And like you said, it's unfamiliar. Maybe it's new in the relationship. So I think that's a piece. Another thing that I see a lot in couples, and it's really interesting, is like if one partner, let's say, again, I'll use a heterosexual couple, heterosexual married couple. So there's a wife, and she has been asking her husband to be open and be connected and have communication. That as he starts to learn that and start to do that, you think she would be really elated and really excited because she's been asking for this. She's not. She's usually really upset. And because it's like all this resentment, there's all these other like moments when he wasn't being emotionally available, right? And then so now that he is, like all that sort of like comes to the surface, because there's a lot of loss there. Not to get too into the weeds on that, but so anyways, those are two things that kind of arise with that piece.
Yeah, they didn't get to like, where's this guy been the whole time, Or,
yeah.
I think also with any healing growth,
late.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh yeah, finally you finally do it. But yeah, I think with any healing journey, I say to our listeners, it's like the first thing you encounter in mindfulness journey is like pain. Right? Like because you just said something like the top of the bucket is like pain, anger, resentment, underneath is all the stuff that, is great. And we get to like the equanimity, the joy, the love, the like present moment, the generosity, gratitude, right? Compassion. But the first like chunk of it is often like pain and trauma. And I think that's a big surprise and wake up call for people, and certainly for couples, where it's like, yeah, we got to get through kind of like the infected wound before we're able to heal it. And that can be tough. So I guess, yeah, how do you prepare couples for that? Or what do you recommend when they start to open up these boxes and they get pain first and foremost?
I mean, I'm biased, obviously, but I recommend they resource themselves. I mean, I think it was helpful for my relationship, and I see it helpful for the couples that I work with. But having somebody outside of the system that can sort of like, lend the prefrontal cortex or sort of like the steadiness to mirror back on some of those things, to validate, to name, to reflect, to normalize some of those things. Oftentimes it's sort of a mindfulness kind of practice in and of itself. Observe, describe non-judgmentally, non-reactively. And if you like as a therapist, often that's what I'm doing for couples. And it's just giving them language. It's helping to sort of like see it, not in like, oh, you did this, but it's like, oh, wow, I'm noticing I'm really reactive, like I'm having thoughts of retaliation, like I just want to like freak that out, to be able to slow that down and be present with that. And that just begins with kind of naming it. And so part of that is skill. As you name it, then you can see it. And once you can see it, then you can be less reactive to it. And it's really the reactivity that's the problem. We want to move from reactivity to response. And that starts with awareness.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, right? It's like those feelings are probably always going to be there, right? You might have that piece that wants to retaliate, or like you brought up the example before, that wants to withdraw. It's always there. But I do agree. It's like about how do you like go left instead of going right, pick a different path down the crossroads there. I think that's really critical, and like not taking that personally. If you can name stuff and, like it's your childhood, in some ways it really helps to depersonalize it and being like, yeah, this is just what I was programmed to. This is just kind of how my brain and body work. So it's not personal. It's like the default response, even though it's not like who you really are. It's really not who you want to be. So another question I have for you, and I kind of fall on a pretty extreme version of this, is like, do you believe that both people in a couple have to do work to have a chance? And I'll say my stance is yes, completely, because I've seen, in over 10 years of practice, I've seen at least the guy do a bunch of work, right, as I tend to work with the men, right? And then if their partner doesn't, or their partner is kind of in this like identified patient thing of like, oh, you're the problem, you go to therapy, is often where it starts, then the person gets better. And I think without that other person taking accountability or doing work, I've seen that relationships like 8 times out of 10 turn into a divorce or fall apart. Well, what do you think about that? Do both people kind of have to build EQ, or do their own healing work?
Yeah, I think to think relationally is to think ecologically. And so I often talk about like me work and we work, and sort of back to that adaptive child, wise adult, so we have our individual work around the adaptive child, because the adaptive child part of us in the relationship is kind of, I often say it's like pissing in your own pool, it's like it's not helping the relationship because it's reactive, it's anti-relational. So that's me work. I have to see my own reactivity and how am I contributing to the ecology of the relationship. And if only one partner does that and the other partner is still sort of reactive, I don't think the system balances into some harmonious kind of position. So yeah, for me, a lot of like my work is often kind of doing individual work within the relational context. So it's really kind of both. It's like, and you can get some gains, if one person is like yelling and really disrespectful and not, and is being, really aggressive or something. If that person stops doing that, that's going to improve the relationship. But it's not going to necessarily get the relationship into sort of its best potential, like homeostasis. There's still some more work to be done, because likely the person that is on the other side of the relationship has developed some sort of adaptation to that aggression. And that's probably some form of withdrawal. And so they're afraid, it's protective. They're not just going to be like, oh, you're done being aggressive, I'm going to open up. That's what we just talked about, where that you finally get what you get. It doesn't just shut off. It's like you got to build that trust. And so that other partner's work might be to come forward a little bit more and to be a little bit more participatory in the relationship. But it's a trust issue and can take some time.
For sure. Yeah. And just hearing it's just like, going through those layers of the onion and being, okay, this is my defense. This is my defense to your defense. This is my defense to your defense to your defense. Right. And just like continuing to get back to kind of a more pure and intimate and vulnerable state, So we were talking a little bit before the show, we talked about kind of this other archetype that we see, which is, often, again, heterosexual, right? You have like the female partner that has been suffering, right? They've been struggling for years. They felt their relationship is dead. Their needs have not been met. They've been like just completely kind of shut down and in some ways have lost hope. They go to couples counseling, they finally get the partner to go. And the guy is like, I don't know anything is wrong, right? Like I thought everything was fine. Like, I don't know what the issue here is. And some of that I'm sure is denial and part of grieving the fact that they're not, the relationship might be ending at that point. But I think a lot of it is actually real. I think guys are not aware of relational subtleties and we're not conditioned to be aware of them. And we can often get away without having to attune to them. So maybe kind of a bigger question, but how would you help someone build that IQ? How does someone get ahead of that and start to become aware of more subtleties in their relationship?
Yeah, I wouldn't even say it's necessarily denial. I think a lot of it is just unawareness. I'll use myself as an example, an earlier version of myself. So in my relationship, when I was younger, there wasn't a lot of anger in my life, right? So like there was a whole like constellation of emotions like anger that I didn't really know how to deal with, right? Like I was sort of even unaware of it. I would just like sort of zoom by it. And so I never responded in my relationship, around like hurts or like when I was angry, because being angry is a normal human emotion. And so that led to some erosion of my relationship, but it wasn't really until my relationship really reached a point of pain where I sort of woke up to like, oh my gosh, there's sort of like this whole piece over here that kind of got socialized out, because that was my experience in my family. But there's also like this larger masculine, like quit crying or I'll give you something to cry about, or like that sort of like, vulnerable feelings aren't allowed, like disappointment and sadness. So I think for a lot of boys, it kind of gets socialized out of them at a pretty early age. So it's sort of like that's why so many men are like, what do you mean? There's sort of like, I see that what you described a lot. We were talking about that earlier. It's just like out of left field, I can't believe my wife is so unhappy. Like she wants to divorce, like that kind of thing. So anyways, I mean, I think I could just relate to that because I think as a man sort of like socialized and sort of like, as a sort of heterosexual white privileged male, there was a moment of me just sort of like awakening and I was just simply unaware. I don't think I really had a sense of it. So depending again on the couple, but a lot of it is, for a lot of men, it might be building that emotional vocabulary, and it might, often I will sort of assign or really encourage men to spend a week just tracking their emotions or using an emotions app, like How We Feel is a great app, but just to start to like, be like, what are my emotions? Not just like mad and desire or something, So it's like learning a new language, if that's the issue around just sort of like not having that emotional awareness. It really is kind of fundamental. It's like learning the vocabulary, starting at the ground up.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really well said, and a lot of the guys I work with are afraid of their emotions or became afraid of their emotions at a young age, either because they saw perhaps their father's emotions like get violent, or like destroy the household. Just anger in particular is what I'm associating to, right? Or I've had, clients that have depressed dads, right? And they're like, shit, I've seen like sadness really like destroy a man. So, and I think our emotions can be violent, right? I mean, without going too much into it, right? It's like the suicide rate for men is way higher. I think it's like 3.5% or 3.5 times higher than the suicide rate for women, because when our emotions go unchecked, we could do some dramatic shit about that, So I think a lot of guys are afraid of that, especially, the younger generation, my generation. There's a lot of nice guys. There's a lot of guys that like, we've suppressed it. We become people pleasers. We really keep everything in a box. And I think we're very dismissive. You talk about, attachment styles, and what I think needs to be talked about more is like the adult version, right? So like there's avoidant, but avoidant when you get older is actually called dismissive attachment style. And I think a lot of men are dismissive, where we have these little hurts and we're just like, no, whatever, doesn't matter. We're like, well, it's fine. We're kind of always brushing these things off, but they're getting stored somewhere. They're getting stored in our body as trauma. They're getting stored, as stress. They're getting stored in this like bucket of resentment that at some point will just like overflow. And that's when it gets really scary for guys. So what I'm hearing you talk about is like being able to talk about those little emotions. Cause I think we're aware of them, but we push them away before we even feel them sometimes,
Yeah, and it's so easy to do in our modern world. It's so easy to look at your phone or like, we can't like in this generally, we don't do very well just sitting with ourselves and doing nothing. You see it in young kids, like they can't handle boredom is like, intolerable. But yeah, no, I think, I mentioned Terry Real earlier. He calls this the original wound for men, and research really sort of supports this. Like 3, 4, 5 years of old boys get disconnected from their feelings. So we start to live in our heads from a very young age, and that's where we live. So to like stop and like reconnect with our body is like we don't feel it this way, but I think really it's terrifying. It's kind of like in the couple when you stop and you're like, wait, we've got all this years, there's a lot there, and so like it's really terrifying to stop and sort of like really look at how you're feeling. It's just a lot easier to just keep doing what you've been doing, like drink another beer or like watch another program or listen, busy yourself with take the edge off some way. And then, because it's hard to slow down, stop, and be honest with yourself.
Yeah, it is hard because I think like, yeah, most haven't done that. I think like most men, right? I think we're honorable. So like when we're like, okay, now this is real, like, fuck, now I have to actually do something about it. Right. Because in some ways, if you just have awareness, it can be worse if you don't act on it. In some, ignorance is bliss.
Yeah. Yeah. No, honestly, I don't know about you. I'd love to hear your response to this. But when I first start working with men, often, especially in both relational or individual contexts, it's like, so much of my work is just reconnecting the mind and the body, like sort of like notice that energy. What is that energy? You might not even be able to name it, but that it's an emotional energy, right? It's the charge. Like, just where do you even notice that? And for a lot of men, don't even really, it takes some time and some skill and some practice to even begin to sort of notice and name that, to sort of like give some languages, because it's so foreign and so disconnected. But yeah, I don't know. I'm curious, like, is that like, how do you work with that emotional piece with men?
I mean, a lot of it, I'm very direct therapist and kind of challenging, because a lot of the guys I work with are highly cognitive, right? So they often say things of like, I don't know how I feel about X, Y, and Z, or I need to figure out how I feel about whatever, right? Like, it's all about the content. And they're kind of like, it's like they're watching a TV, right? They're like watching a movie of like, okay, if there was a character that was going through the same situation as me, how would that character feel? It's like so detached in a lot of ways. So a lot of times I'm just like, okay, what do you actually feel about it? You know, like mad, sad, glad, excited, or afraid, you know? And I'm like trying to like really break through that cognitive wall, because so many guys, I think we have that as a defense against the like visceral emotional experience. And we're often not aware of how we actually feel. And sometimes we feel things that are very discordant, you know, like I work a lot with shadow material. So sometimes, you know, if our partner is struggling, we might actually feel joy about that. You know, we might be like, yeah, she gets what she deserves, you know, like, or if somebody, if there's like grief and we're supposed to be sad, we might actually feel relieved. And I try to get guys to be like brutally honest about their experience, good, bad, and ugly, because that it's not about being a good or bad person. It's about being like, okay, this informs maybe some content that you're not talking about. You know, I think so many men in the modern world are like playing a role, and we're really disconnected from who we are as humans. We're trying to be like good workers, good dads, good partners, good people. And yeah, I think it cuts a lot off.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's about, I mean, I was using like honesty, you know, it's like being honest with what your experience is. And that's a skill. For sure.
Yeah, and then doing something about it, right? Being like, okay, we got the insight, but now we're at the action. And I think like, yeah, I think a lot of our industry fails men because it's insight focused versus being like action focused and being like, okay, now we know this. There probably is much more to figure out here, but like, what are you going to do about it? And I really try to hold my guys accountable and challenge them to like take meaningful action, or else nothing changes, you know?
I love that. We should do another episode. That is just on that. It's so traditional therapy really does that. How do you feel? How do you feel without like, if you don't feel that next moment with something meaningful, important, or action oriented, usually it just like, you just bound to sort of fall back into that sort of way of thinking and feeling. So I love to hear you say that. Yes, I think traditional therapy gets that wrong. Or in couples therapy, traditional couples therapy is like about emotional expression. But that's not like, just like that just charges, you know, it actually doesn't do the relationship any favors, just to unload unbridled self-expression about what all your emotions are. It's like, no, the next action is care. Like, what do you do to care for the situation that you're in? If it, you know, the emotion, but anyways, yeah, I get charged by that idea.
Oh, for sure. I think it's a whole presentation on this that I do, but like, kind of the punchline of it is that like with men, a lot of the sessions, especially once we know their story, it's like briefing, action, debriefing, right? The sessions really change. They become like, okay, we know all this stuff. We know about your childhood. We know about your trauma. We know about your issues. Like, this session is about strategizing. In between, you're going to go have that conversation with your partner. You're going to go talk to your boss. You're going to go make that change. You're going to go not drink as much, whatever, and then debrief the next session and be like, okay, what actually worked, what didn't. And I think men need that. I think we need that level of like coaching to be effective, because I think the traditional male doesn't see value in expressing emotions. And I'll go as far as say that there might not be as much value there for us. You know, I think we are builders and doers and workers, and a lot of us are experiential learners. And like, without changing our environment, therapy can feel like a pity party for a lot of guys. And I don't think we want to feel like we're being pitied. We want to feel like we are the hero and that we're like doing something to fight this demon, you know, and fix this issue.
Yeah, I think, I think that it's somewhere in between, because I think you can run the risk of just doing, and not being, if we could use that language, but just being is sort of like not necessarily healthy either. So a lot of like what I do as men start to develop that emotional vocabulary is like unwind the judgment around that. Like ultimately your emotions, is Latin for in motion. All of your emotions are like, they're like indicators for what you need. So if you're feeling lonely, then you need to connect. So you build in the service of connection. Or if you're feeling anxious, you need to prepare. If you're feeling angry, a boundary's been crossed. So like there's the receptivity to what the emotion is. What is it? Shame, embarrassment, disappointment, anger, lust. Then from there, then you can build in the right direction. So it's like alignment of both like what your experience is and then moving in directions that are meaningful and important. And sometimes we can like, if we're too into the emotions and we flare in all different directions, right? Like without intention, and that can be harmful. Or if we're not aware of what we're feeling, we're then doing what we should be doing. Then we get into like, I should be a professional and make a lot of money or whatever. Maybe that's important to you, but maybe not. And if it's not, then you're going to end up like, disappointed and lonely and regretful and all those other things. So anyways, that's the art of living, right? It's somewhere in the middle. How do we honor and be honest with what our experience is? And then how do we move in directions that are meaningful and important?
Yeah. When I like that you're saying that like the emotions is like another information stream, and they all contain a message, right? There's data there telling us what to do. And it seems so obvious, but again, I think our industry really does fail some dudes where like, it's not about coping with those emotions, right? Like if you're anxious, like you said, it's like, it's telling you to prepare. It's telling you to like do something. It's trying to mobilize energy by using like the stress response system, the fight or flight mechanism, to like get you to like do something and get ready for this big event that's happening, and it's like also could be branded as anticipation or as excitement, right? But yeah, I think so much of our industry can focus on like coping and like trying to de-escalate, which can be helpful if it gets you then preparing, right? But I think, yeah, some of the messages are around like, it's like continuing to push that away and not being like, oh, there's a reason why I'm anxious. There's a reason why I'm angry. There's probably even a reason why you're depressed. None of these things come from nowhere. They're not just like random. There is a message in each one of those emotions. And I think it's worth building EQ to be able to tap into that and then really use that as like a compass in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. So back to mindfulness, observing, describing non-judgmentally, non-reactively, it's like, yeah. Yeah. Our system, I'll just say, like, I was in healthcare for a long time, and it's like, even your screens, when you come in, it's like, well, what's your anxiety? Like it's sending a message that that's a problem. It's like already like, that's the sort of the message under the message is like, this is the problem we're here to fix. Well, if anxiety is a problem, we try to solve it. Now I've got more of it. And because it's not a problem, it's not solvable. It's something to be experienced. It's like, we're actually creating more anxiety. So it's like, we're actually making it worse by calling it a problem and trying to manage it, like use it.
Building shame, right? It's like, oh, there's something wrong with me because I'm anxious, right? Well, so we're moving towards the end of our program here. I want to give you a chance to kind of speak to the listeners. Like, is there something that they could do, maybe a prompt, maybe a conversation that they could have with their partner if they want to bring some of this mindful relating into their relationship, like today? Something that's like kind of a freebie, right? That they could be like, hey, let's just start to work.
Yeah. Maybe something like, I love this. Like, is it kind? Like, like it's that simple. It's like back to like kindergarten, like just be kind. We tend to want to be right. Like be kind instead of be right, for example. Seek to understand, like listen to understand, not to like sort of take a position. So get curious. Look up what is like active listening, and practice listening. We most couples come to me, I have two speakers and really in any relationship at any time, there should be one speaker and one listener, and so that would be another thing is like to practice being a listener, would be some other things. And then the other thing we kind of talked about it. I mean, if you're in a relationship, like good relational hygiene make some time for your relationship, build it, find it. If you've got 3 kids and busy jobs, it might be 5 minutes on a Tuesday evening at 8:55. I mean, you take what you can get. But it's kind of like brushing your teeth, it's like, don't take one vacation every once a year and that's your time. It's better to brush your teeth 1 minute every day than it is for 4 hours once a month. And your relationship is the same way. If you're not brushing your relationship on a regular basis, you're going to end up with cavities, relational root canals and things like that. So prioritize your relationship. Make time.
I like that. Yeah. I think stuff's going to build up and it's going to be like a lot of, misunderstandings and misconceptions and assumptions. So I like the idea of clearing the air, emptying out that resentment bucket every once in a while, just like checking in with your partner. I think that's really critical. Well, Donald, this has been a great episode. Always love chatting with you. Where can people learn more about you and find you online if they want to work with you or just listen to more of your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I mean, it's great to connect with you. I appreciate our conversations and always, it's nice knowing you're out there doing some great work. So thank you for your work, supporting other men, and by extension, those they care about. Where people, I'm online, Aligned on Purpose, is the name of my, practice, onpurposementoring.com is where you can find me. Or if you have my name, which is, I'm not going to go ahead and spell it, but if it's in the show notes or something like that, if you just Google that, you'll find me. So yeah, feel free to reach out if I can support anybody who's out there listening. For sure, happy to do that.
Yeah, check him out, reach out to him. He's got some good stuff on his Instagram as well. He's got videos and things that you can listen to and learn from. All that stuff will be in the show notes. We'll have a link to Donald's website as well as all the social media accounts and things like that. So if you want to shoot him a follow or get to know him. Listeners, thank you again for tuning in. If this was really useful for you, share it. Do all the social stuff, right? Like, share, comment, subscribe. Give us a 5-star review, especially on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Those really go a long way to supporting the show. Following us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube under Men's Therapy Online, the overarching company that Men's Therapy Podcast is a part of. Take a look at us. Check us out, menstherapy.online. And share this podcast with someone that you think needs to hear it, someone that is, in a couple that might be struggling or needs to have more communication or, someone that needs to build this relationship hygiene. I think it's a great starting place and a great set of tools and skills that you can use to really get intimacy in your life. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next week in another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. And don't forget to visit menstherapy.online to learn more about the work that we are doing to support and inspire men. Until next time, keep moving forward.